Hi again. We were talking about introduction to interpretation, and then I thought we actually mentioned the difference between interpretation and translation. Now we are going to dive into it thoroughly and look at the differences between them. Because actually, translation is a general word for everything which should be transmitted from one language to the other, but interpretation is nowadays used for more different skill set. Let's look at the differences together. Interpretation versus translation. And then after that, you decide which one is good for you, or maybe both. Translation and interpretation are two distinct processes, and there seems to have a confusion distinguishing one from the other. But they are nonetheless closely related. They involve careful comprehension of a message in a source language and its transference into another language, like all the translations are, or should be. In both activities, you need to have a mastery of at least two languages, an extensive and updated knowledge of general events, and the skills, techniques, and ability for language exchange and message transfer. I kind of see that you didn't like that one part, mastery of languages. That's okay with you, but updated knowledge of general events, oh shoot, you have to read a lot. You have to listen a lot. You have to go and keep up with the world's happenings. There you go. You didn't like it? You will. Just try. Successful translators and interpreters must therefore be extensive readers in both languages, as well as critical observers, so they remain up to date with current events and latest trends. Ladies and gentlemen, since I have the glasses, the reading glasses here, maybe you might think that, well, she looks knowledgeable. That's true, thank you. I am modest, but I am. And she probably reads a lot and likes reading a lot. The first sentence is correct, the second one is absolutely not. I actually don't like reading, but there is a dilemma. I like information. I'm curious. So there's only one way. Either I said two ways. Either I'm gonna watch a lot, which I'm doing, but sometimes it's not enough. So unfortunately, I read a lot. Look at how heavy that material is. How can I not read it before talking to you? So if you are really interested in something, you have to read a lot. Interpretation is commonly defined as the oral transfer of a message from one language to the other. Translation is a generic term, as I told you, like a general term that covers both written translation, or simply translation, and oral translation, which is interpretation. In other words, one may call at one point translation, which includes the concept of interpretation, while in another may sense it is not. So basically, you have to decide on which way to go. Some do both. It is the written source text, anyway, which is the translator's starting point. This text is a concrete entity with a definite form of its own, which the translator has to respect at the same time as he communicates the message. On the other hand, the interpreter's medium is speech, which is a transitory entity. Why? This is because what is remembered is not the exact formulation of the message, but the message itself. Moreover, in speech, the message is communicated not only by the linguistic signs uttered by the speaker's gestures, tone of voice, etc., but also indirectly by the audience's reactions. Yeah, because you're not alone with the paper in a silent room and have the luxury of focusing on what's been written. You have to follow the reader here, alive in three-dimensional form, sitting or standing next to you, or you're in a room and he's talking there, right there, and everybody's listening. You're not alone. You're surrounded by knowledge and important people. The interpreter, who is physically present during the original communication, has to take into account not only the words he hears, but also the dynamics of the communicative situation. What's going on there in the room, in this area. Here we have a source from Wikipedia, encyclopedia. We can study the following definition of interpretation and translation. Sometimes they really do a good job. Although I told you that you have to go there, be careful, and also watch and follow the other sources as well. But Wikipedia is mostly doing a very good job. Maybe you're going to be one of the writers one day and put your own insight. Despite being used in a non-technical sense as interchangeable, interpretation and translation are not synonymous. Interpreting takes a message from a source language and renders that message into a different target language, like English into French. In interpreting, the interpreter will take in a complex concept from one language, choose the most appropriate vocabulary in the target language, and that happens in 2 or 3 seconds sometimes, to faithfully render the message in a linguistically, emotionally, tonally, and culturally equivalent message. Wow. You have to not only be a linguist, but also an actor. That's very important. I'll tell you later. Maybe I'm going to ask one of my directors here to come to me here and accompany me and try that I'm telling you in English and they're suddenly transferring it into different languages such as Korean, and we'll see how it works. No, I will leave it to you, to the future expert. Translation is the transference of meaning from text to text, written or recorded, with the translator having time and access to resources. What resources? Dictionaries, glossaries, to produce an accurate document or verbal artifact. We also talked about the dissertation sometimes, that you have to go through some scholarly materials for that. So you don't have the luxury of just, I said what I heard and that's it. No, you have to research. And lesser known is transliteration. Trans, going in between, literation, comes actually from literature and literal and all that stuff, used within sign language in interpreting. Takes one form of a language and transfer those same words into another form. Gestures. Spoken English into signed form of English. Signed exact English, not ASL we are talking about. In court interpretation, it is not acceptable to omit anything from the source. We actually mentioned that when we were talking about the law and legal documents. No matter how fast the source speaks, since not only is accuracy a principal canon for interpreters, but mandatory, must have. The alteration of even a single word in a material can totally mislead the trials of fact. Maybe, for example, even the difference between maybe and maybe, I suddenly thought now. Although maybe comes from maybe, it can be totally different maybe. So you have to take care of this. This most important factor for this level of accuracy is the use of a team of 2 or more interpreters during a lengthy process, with one actively interpreting and the second monitoring for greater accuracy. Teamwork. Translators have time to consider and revise each word. Like I told you, you are maybe a free will detective, and sentence before delivering their product to the client. While live interpretation's goal is to achieve total accuracy at all times, details of the original source speech can be missed and interpreters can ask for clarification from the speakers. In any language, including sign languages, when a word is used for which there is no exact match, expansion may be necessary in order to fully interpret the intended meaning of the word. Example, the English word hospitable may require several words or phrases to encompass its complex meaning. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is one of the biggest challenges, the difference between the translation and interpretation. For example, if somebody says something which the word has only a definition but not an exact synonyms, then you have to define it. For example, let's look at hospitable as a very nice example. I'm thinking in Turkish, we would say elverişli, but elverişli is like eligible or available. No, it's not. It's also accommodating. But even accommodating I can't translate without explain. Yaşamaya elverişli, which means available for living. Oturmaya elverişli, available for staying, but not staying, actually residing. But hospitable, it also includes that hospitality thing. Wow, I'm happy that I'm not interpreting right now. I'm just actually delivering the message. Another unique situation is when an interpreted message appears much shorter or longer than the original message. The message may appear shorter at times because of the unique differences and efficiencies within a certain language. English to Spanish is a prime example. I don't speak Spanish, I only can sing in Spanish, but I have a bit of an idea through French how the grammar actually works. Spanish uses gender-specific nouns. Oh God, German has 3 of them, 3 articles, de adidas. At least French and probably Latin languages have the le, la, and English is just the. That's nice. Okay, not used in English, which convey information in a more condensed package, thus requiring more words and time an English interpretation to provide the same plethora of information because of those differences. Because of situations like these, interpreting often requires a lag or processing time. Come on, we are not machines, but we are better than them. This time allows the interpreter to take in subjects and verbs in order to rearrange grammar appropriately while picking accurate vocabulary before starting the message. While working with interpreters, it is important to remember lag time in order to avoid accidentally interrupting one another and to receive the entire message. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some things to say here. I hope that it will probably interest you. Since I have been teaching now for many years, many different languages, such as I am talking one Altaic language as Turkish, 2 Germanic languages, English and German, and 1 Latin language, French. And when I teach Korean, Japanese, Filipino students, or Portuguese speakers, Brazilians, or Swiss people, German Swiss people, I see the difference in my teaching grammar. Just because of that, because the sentence structure is different. For example, in Korean, Japanese, Turkish, we say I to the cinema go. We don't say I go to the cinema. That's the word order, subject, object, verb. And we don't have the prepositions. We have it sometimes as like suffixes connected with the word already, like legal. But in English, it's to me, it was upside down. And then I was so happy to be mastering a German language, which is German, and I thought English will be very easy after that because they are connected. They are not as connected as I wanted them to be. Because German, for example, doesn't have the continuous tenses. What am I going to do now? So these are the things specifically. It is okay when you master the 2 languages and you have them in written form, you have time to digest the difference and let the reader understand the upside down sentences. You can figure out a way to rewrite them in that. But when you're interpreting, imagine Frau Merkel, EU has a problem sometimes, and German lady leader Frau Merkel is talking something and I have to translate it into French totally differently or to English. How am I going to wait to put the certain parts of the speech into the right place? So you have to be you think you have to have an IQ of 250 like Einstein. Yes and no, but you need practice. Practice, ladies and gentlemen, knowledge and practice. For sure, we assume that you are already very intelligent. Okay, let's continue reading. Oh, they have a beautiful picture here. This is the place of a European Court of Justice. I think our European friends are dealing a lot with nowadays. The discussion above shows, now we're continuing with the reading material, the common similarities and differences between interpretation and translation. The confusion between translation and interpretation is clearly revealed by the constant use of the term simultaneous translation. For simultaneous refers specifically to the mode of interpretation. You cannot translate simultaneously in written form. Maybe someone can try that. Can you imagine? Somebody is talking in Korean, and while listening to that person, you are writing what he's saying in English. Oh my God, there you really need 250 IQ. Maybe you can do it. Try. Simultaneous means the act of translation synchronized, done, and cannot apply to the generic translation. No, we don't expect you to do that much. Let's look at the different modes of interpretation, and specifically the simultaneous one, which seems to be very challenging. In extempore, simultaneous interpretation, SI, we like these acronyms, the interpreter renders the message in the target language as quickly as he or she can formulate it from the source language. While the source language speaker continuously speaks, a spoken language SI interpreter sitting in a soundproof booth speaks into a microphone while clearly seeing and hearing the source language speaker via earphones. The simultaneous interpretation is rendered to the target language listeners via their earphones. Moreover, SI is the common mode used by sign language interpreters. Although the person using the source language, the interpreter, the target language recipient, since either the hearing person or deaf person may be delivering the message, we never know, must necessarily be in close proximity. The first introduction and employment of extempore simultaneous interpretation was the Nuremberg trials. I know you're too young maybe to remember that, but you can look it up. With 4 official working languages. Wow, all at the same time. Consecutive. In consecutive interpreting, CI, there you have a better chance. The interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has finished speaking. It goes like that. Now I'm speaking this sentence, I repeat it, and I show you how it goes. In consecutive interpreting SI, the interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has finished speaking. Sonradan yapılan tercümelerde tercüme eden kişi tercümeyi yapmadan önceki duyduklarından sonra tercümeye geçer. Önce ilk şahıs konuşur, ondan sonra tercüme yapılır. Like that. I said the same thing a little bit longer in Turkish. What I said in. It goes almost in that section. The speech is divided into segments, and the interpreter sits or stands beside the source language speaker, listening and taking notes as the speaker progresses through the message. When the speaker pauses or finishes speaking, the interpreter only hopes for that. The interpreter then renders a portion of the message or the entire message in the target language. So here you have a little bit time to process. Consecutive interpretation is rendered short as CI or long CI. In short CI, the interpreter relies on memory, each message segment being brief enough to memorize. In long CI, the interpreter takes notes, how can she or he remember everything, of the message to aid rendering long passages. These informal divisions are established with the client before the interpretation is effected, depending upon the subject, its complexity, and the purpose of the interpretation. Are you still there? Good. On occasion, Document sight translation is required. So what is this? Now we are talking about the deaf and this now sight. So what's going on? Sight translation is just reading a translation aloud. Combines interpretation and translation for sure. Everything in that area. The interpreter must render the source language document to target language as if it were written in the target language. Sight translation occurs usually, but not exclusively, in judicial and medical work. Like, I am now looking at that and reading it to you in French or German, kind of translation. This is in English, as you see. Consecutively, oh, I'm so happy that they didn't expect me to do that. I suddenly think, well, Leila, look at that and explain it to the students in German. Mein Gott, das ist sehr schwer. Consecutively interpreted speeches, or segments of them, tend to be short. 50 years ago, right when I was 5 years old, the CI interpreter would render speeches of 20 or 30 minutes. Today, it is 10 or 15 minutes only because the audiences don't want to listen to a language they don't know of for too long. We became more and more impatient. The time is running faster, ladies and gentlemen. Often, if not previously advised, the source language speaker is unaware that he or she may speak more than a single sentence before the CI interpretation is rendered, and might stop after each sentence to await its target language rendering. I sometimes see when I watch a political show where world greats are talking, and then suddenly they hear the interpreter and they just kind of are confused. Now, should I stop and give him time to interpret, or will I be going on and he can catch up or not? So it's actually we have to inform them how the interpretation would be in order not to confuse the audience. Maybe you should remind them of. Sometimes, however, depending upon the setting or subject matter, and upon the interpreter's capacity to memorize for sure, the interpreter may ask the speaker to pause after each sentence or after each clause. That's why I'm saying, determine the situation yourself and make the original speaker, if you cannot access to them, you cannot go to Obama and say, hey, Mr. Barack, please, just 3 sentences and give me some time. But there will be definitely a person who can do it for you. Sentence by sentence interpreting requires less memorization and therefore lower likelihood for omissions. Yet, its disadvantages in the interpreters not having heard the entire speech or its gist, because of the different structure, grammar structure in sentences, and sometimes the main thing can come at the end of the sentence. So how would you be able to translate it before hearing the main idea at the end of the sentence? Very important, which rhythm are you at while translating? Oh my God, the more I think, the more I like it actually. I like challenges. Hope you do too. And for example, imagine a joke told in bits and pieces with breaks for translation in between. This method is often used in rendering speeches, depositions, recorded statements, court witness testimony where there are no jokes mainly, and medical and job interviews. But it's usually best to complete a whole idea before it's interpreted. So it is more secure, safer to really understand the point. And to be able to understand the point, you literally need the period, which looks like a point. Full, in other words, unbroken consecutive interpreting of whole thoughts allows for the full meaning of the source language message to be understood before the interpreter renders it in the target language. This affords a truer, more accurate, more accessible interpretation than simultaneous interpretation does. Now, there are certain techniques we will be talking about, kinds of interpretations again. 3. whispered. In whispered interpreting, chuchotage in French, the interpreter sits or stands next to the small target language audience whilst whispering a simultaneous interpretation of the matter to hand. This method requires no equipment because you're whispering, but may be done via microphone or headphones if the participants prefer. Chuchotage is used in circumstances where the majority of the group speaks the source language and the minority, ideally no more than 3 people, does not speak it. Because if the majority talks actually the source language, and if the majority is like say 30 people sitting in a room and only 3 people don't know the language and there is an interpreter, after every 5 sentences he turns it into the language of these 3 people and all the other ones wait, oh my god. So in order to avoid the situation, the interpreter very, very silently says, well, no, Leila is talking about how the interpretation is being done. Enough. Okay. Now relay. Relay interpreting is usually used when there are several target languages. You know, it's getting broader and broader. A source language interpreter interprets to text to a language common to every interpreter, who then renders the message to their respective target languages. For example, a Japanese source message first is rendered to English to a group of interpreters who speak English, who listen to the English and render the message into Arabic, French, and Russian or other target languages. Does it look a little bit confusing? Not at all. See, I am saying something in Turkish and I don't speak English. You speak Turkish and English, and there are 2 or 3 more people who speak English. I say Turkish, you translate into English, and all these other people speak English and they understand it. One translates the English you are talking to Arabic, the other one understands your English and translates it to Russian, and on and on and on. Wow, chain reaction basically. Where do we use it? Here. In heavily multilingual meetings, there may be more than one intermediate language common. For example, a Greek source language could be interpreted into English, and then from English to other languages. And at the same time, it may also be directly interpreted into French, and from French into yet more languages. This solution is most often used in the multilingual or multilingual, when you're from United States, meetings of the EU, European Union institutions. They must be very interesting out there in the European Union. Okay, 5. Liaison. Liaison, ladies and gentlemen, actually is a French word, as you probably hear it, although we use it in English. It's kind of like connection, going into each other, liaise. Liaison in interpreter's world involves relaying what is spoken to one person between 2 or among many people. This can be done after a short speech or consecutively sentence by sentence, or as chuchotage, whispering, aside from notes taken at the time. No equipment is used. So basically it goes like that. Liaison, somebody is spoken to me and I am actually with 2 or 3 other interpreters, I am working on it and interpreting or translating it in the same time orally to those people. This can be done easily because it's kind of relaying technique. 2 processes of one basic operation. In general, translation and interpretation are 2 modes of one basic process. The many parallels between translation and interpretation include the skills, knowledge, theories, and expressions required for both activities on a mastery of at least 2 languages in a wide general knowledge, and on the techniques of message transfer and language switching. So as you see, you have to almost play a violin with languages. Moreover, we're going to come to that. Moreover, both translation and interpretation involve two basic operations: comprehension of the message in the source language, our beautiful SL, reproduction of that message in the target language, the TL. The overall process of translation and of interpretation is very similar, yet there are important differences between them, as you might have already guessed, because we talked of many of them. One major cause of difference is the different medium of linguistic communication employed. Their workplaces are different, let's say so. Let's look at those workplaces. Types of interpretation. Conference. Conference interpreting is the interpretation of a conference, either simultaneously or consecutively, although the advent of multilingual meetings has consequently reduced the consecutive interpretation in the last 20 years. Like we mentioned, people don't want to wait too much between the translations or interpretations. Conference interpretation is divided between two markets: the institutional and private. International institutions, you might have already heard all of them: EU, European Union, United Nations, EPO, etc. No, etc. sounds also like one of them. It's just one more. Holding multilingual or multilingual meetings often favor interpreting several foreign languages to the interpreter's mother tongues. Local private markets tend to be bilingual meetings, the local language plus another. And the interprets work both into and out of their mother tongues. The markets are not mutually exclusive. There is a nice association, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. Thank God they're all associated, so you can belong to. Is the only worldwide association of conference interpreters. Founded in 1953, it assembles more than 2,800 professional conference interpreters in more than 90 countries. Why shouldn't you be one of them? Judicial. See also legal translation, we talked about it a lot. Judicial, legal, or court interpreting occurs in courts of justice, administrative tribunals, and wherever a legal proceeding is held. For example, police station for an interrogation, a conference room for a deposition, or the local for taking a sworn statement. Legal interpreting can be the consecutive interpretation of witness testimony, for example, or the simultaneous interpretation of entire proceedings by electronic means for one person or all of the people attending. Sometimes you're probably watching some of them in the media when there is a huge national crime has been committed or international crime has been committed. Lately, when you can remember the big terrorist attack in Norway, and we sometimes look at in the courtrooms, they sometimes allow the media to come. There you can have it. You can follow that, how it happens there. The right to a competent interpreter for anyone who does not understand the language of the court, especially for the accused in a criminal trial, is usually considered a fundamental rule of justice. We actually open that up also in the law and legal translation section. Therefore, this right is often guaranteed in national constitutions, declarations of rights, fundamental laws establishing the justice system, or by precedents set by the highest courts. However, it is not a constitutionally required procedure in the United States. In every country it might be different, that a certified interpreter be present at police interrogation. Every country is different again, depending upon the regulations and standards adhered to per state or venue. Court interpreters usually work alone when interpreting consecutively or as a team when interpreting simultaneously. In addition to practical mastery of the source and target languages, through knowledge of law and legal and court procedures is required of court interpreters. I told you that in legal matters, you cannot skip anything. So simultaneously interpreting might actually skip some of the little details normally when an actor is talking or when a maybe politician is talking in a press conference. The simultaneous interpreter might actually change the talking by creatively and very quickly chosen alternative words where the law doesn't allow this. So it's actually way more responsible, bigger responsibility to do it in the law court if you're a simultaneous interpreter. They often require to have formal authorization from the state to work in the courts, that's why. And then are called certified court interpreters. In many jurisdictions, the interpretation is considered an essential part of the evidence. Incompetent interpretation or simply failure to swear in the interpreter can lead to mistrial. So this is really very difficult. Yes, lady. Yes, lady, about where to interpret and interpretation styles and workplaces, different workplaces. Where will you be working? One of them is escorting. In escort interpreting, an interpreter accompanies a person or a delegation on a tour, on a visit, or to a meeting or interview. An interpreter is in this role is called an escort interpreter or an escorting interpreter. This is liaison interpreting. You know, it's we talked about that before. And then you could be hired and employed in public sector, also known as community interpreting, is the type of interpreting occurring in fields such as legal, health, and local government, social, housing, environmental health, education, and welfare systems or services. In community interpreting, factors exist which determine and affect language and communication production, such as speech's emotional content, hostile or polarized social surroundings, its created stress, the power relationships among participants, and the interpreter's degree of responsibility. In many cases, more than extreme. In some cases, even the life of the other person depends upon the interpreter's work. So public jobs can be very, very responsible. And medical, there we go. So I always tell, law and medicine, these are the two sectors. I mean, you have to be perfectionist in everything what you're doing in order to look at the mirror with a good conscience, and I mean putting your head to the pillow with a good conscience, but not as much as medical and law. Medical interpreting is a subset of public service interpreting. So that's why we told that some of the lives depend upon it. And consisting of communication among medical personnel and the patient and his or her family, or among medical personnel speaking different languages, facilitated by an interpreter, usually formally educated and qualified to provide such interpretation services. In some situations, medical employees who are multilingual may participate part-time as members of internal language banks, because you really need to be almost like a doctor for that. The medical interpreter must have a strong knowledge of medicine, common medical procedures, the patient interview, the medical examination process, ethics, and the daily workings of the hospital or clinic where he or she works in order to effectively serve both the patient and the medical personnel. Ladies and gentlemen, for a while, a couple of years ago, I also taught medical English. So I know very well the very subtle differences between languages when it comes to medical issues. Even when a patient wants to talk about the pain, and even the word pain, and many different variations of excruciating pain or stabbing pain or burning sensation, for example. If you don't actually explain them properly, you might mislead the doctor. So it's very important and very, 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 very cautious one must be. Moreover, and very important, medical interpreters are often cultural liaisons for people regardless of the language, who are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable in hospital, clinical or medical settings. Situation in China, we given information here without having any comment on it, that's just a fact. There is no mandatory certificate for medical interpreters in China as of 2012. So what happens then? Most interpretation in hospitals in China is done by doctors directly, who are proficient in both Chinese and English, mostly, in his or her specialty. They interpret more in academic settings than for communications between doctors and patients. When a patient needs English service in a Chinese hospital, more often than not she or he will be directed to a staff member in the hospital who are recognized by his or her colleagues as proficient in English. So he's not a doctor, he's a staff, and people think that he is a master of English if you want to have an English translation or interpretation. The actual quality of such service for patients or medical translation for communications between doctors speaking different languages is unknown by the interpreting community, as interpreters who lack medical background rarely receive reputation for medical translation in the medical community. Is this sentence difficult to understand? It basically says, in one country, just an example, only the doctors are doing the actual academic translation, but when it comes to communication, like a more daily communication between the patients and the health staff or healthcare staff, there is only like staff members who are known as English speakers eligible to do that or available. So that can cause some problems as well. So you have to pay attention to where you're working, what you're doing. Now we are here with sign language and a very nice picture given. When a hearing person speaks, an interpreter will render the speaker's meaning into the sign language used by the deaf party. When a deaf person signs, an interpreter will render the meaning expressed in the signs into spoken language for the hearing party, which is sometimes referred to as voice interpreting or just voicing. So you basically turn the gestures and the signs into sounds. This may be performed either as simultaneous or consecutive interpreting. Skilled sign language interpreters will position themselves in a room or space that allows them both to be seen by deaf participants and heard by hearing participants clearly, and to see and hear participants clearly. In some circumstances, an interpreter may interpret from one sign language into an alternate sign language. Ladies and gentlemen, even if you are hearing impaired, the difficulty doesn't leave you alone. So see, we were talking about there is differences between the law of the countries, there are differences between the medical perception between the two countries. Sign language should be international, isn't it? No, it isn't. So even the sign language has culture, and you should be aware of this. Deaf people also work as interpreters. They team with hearing counterparts to provide interpretation for deaf individuals who may not share the standard sign language used in that country, who have minimal language skills, are developmentally delayed, or have other mental or physical disabilities, which make communication a unique challenge. I want to add you something here. We're talking about the deaf people, or we sometimes talk about blind people, or people with some obstacles. In North America, if you actually translate, say you are French, or you are a Spaniard, or you are a Filipino, and want to translate something where we use these kind of disability words, such as blind, deaf, mentally impaired. So there is something which we are very much interested in and take a lot of caution, which is called political correctness of the language. For example, in Canada, the word deaf or blind is not being used so much. Instead, we use with hearing impaired and sight impaired. So that's exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about culture. When we talk about blind, 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 and actually for the sight impaired people, use that while you're translating, you might be offending a Canadian listener. So these are little things which countries are very sensitive about. You should take care of this too. And also, other political correctness issues, such as we don't say cameraman anymore, camera person. We don't say one woman show anymore, one person show, because of the gender differences shouldn't be underlined in North America. As much as we don't put our private information into our resumes. For example, you don't put your marital status, you don't put your age, whereas in Europe and in Turkey, where I'm coming from, it's important to know what is your religion, are you married, not in here, because people are kind of trying to avoid any discrimination. So that's just being said in brackets. In other cases, the hearing interpreter may interpret in one language than the deaf interpreter might interpret into another form of that language. There we have the word here, pigeons. Now what is pigeons? Are they the beautiful birds which are having in the city like pigeon? Same pronunciation. It's a homophone of our bird pigeon. Pigeon is, ladies and gentlemen, very interesting. It's a made-up language for the people who live in a country as immigrants. They have their own mother language, and another group has also her or his or its mother language, and they share in common a kind of the language of the host country. Oh God, that was a too long sentence. Shortly like that. Imagine you are Korean and I am Turkish. We don't speak English very well, we both. And our actually, specifically talking about Korean and Turkish, or Japanese, we have a similar sense of grammar. So what happens? We are creating our own English, only we understand what we are talking about. In Canada, we have a lot Chinese population, and we are talking about Chinglish, like Chinese English. This is a kind of pidgin. That's what we call. Where does the word pigeon comes? Where does it come from? It comes from business. How? This is the Chinese pronunciation of English word business. I don't know how they write it in pinyin, but that happened like that. Also, right, I remembered, probably now even Queen Elizabeth is using it. We say, hi, long time no see. Think about it. Is it a right grammar? Long time no see. What is no see? No and the base verb. This is not English. Yes, it is. This is actually created by the first Chinese pioneers who came to North America, and even probably being used by Prince Charles today. It became English. And as you know, languages are organic things, breathing and living. How would you say it in a right grammar? We should say, long time, maybe not seen. I haven't seen you for a long time is the right grammar. But nobody says long time not seen. We say long time no see. Okay. Continue with coming from culture into this. They also relay, these deaf interpreters also relay information from one medium of language into another. For example, when a person is signing visually, the deaf interpreter could be hired to copy those signs into a deaf blind person's hand and add visual information. Ladies and gentlemen, it's getting more and more complicated, as you see. So sight and hearing impaired language is coming up now, and we can only hope that there is only one of it. Then when you have the sight and hearing impaired person's language And when you have to translate that also into other cultures' sight and hearing impaired person's language, you might slowly go insane. But yes, it is as deep as it is. In the United States, sign language interpreters have national and state level associations. That's good. They are organized. The Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID. They still use the deaf. We have to change it as Canadian. A non-profit national certifying body. In addition to training requirements and stringent certification testing, the RID members must obey by a code of professional conduct, grievance process, and continuing education requirement. So they are very well organized. In Europe, each country has its own national association of sign language interpreters. Some countries have more than one national association due to regional or language differences. We talked about the dialects and everything. The European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, EFSLI, is the umbrella organization of sign language interpreters in Europe, and I think that they're very busy nowadays. Sign language interpreters can be found in all types of interpreting situations as listed in this article. Most interpreters have had formal training. In an interpreter training program, ITP, we love these abbreviations. Lengths vary, being available as a 2-year or 4-year degree or certificate. There are graduate programs available as well. And media, for sure. By its very nature, media interpreting has to be conducted in the simultaneous mode. It is provided particularly for live television coverage, such as press conferences, live or taped interviews with political figures, musicians, artists, sportsmen, or people from the business circle, and many more. In this type of interpreting, the interpreter has to sit in a soundproof booth where ideally he or she can see the speakers on a monitor and the set. All equipment, ladies and gentlemen, should be checked before recording begins. In particular, satellite connections have to be double-checked to ensure that the interpreter's voice is not sent back and the interpreter gets to hear only one channel at a time. In the case of the interviews recorded outside the studio and some current affairs program, the interpreter interprets what he or she hears on a TV monitor. That's easy? No. Background noise is a problem here, can be a serious problem. The interpreter working for the media has to sound as slick and confident as a television presenter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to share with you something I have read in the news once upon a time, not too much time ago though. Mrs. Hillary Clinton was actually having a press conference in one of the South Asian, I guess, countries, and one of the journalists, local journalists, wanted to ask a question. It was about the foreign policy, because she's the Secretary of the State. She wanted to know, this journalist lady, what Mr. President Obama thinks about the topic. What is actually his opinion? And the interpreter lady, probably still being in the idea of Bill Clinton is the current president and not President Obama, misinterpreted and asked, "Excuse me, Mrs. Clinton, but what does Mr. Clinton think about that topic?" And Mrs. Clinton, who has earned that interesting and very valuable status as a woman with pride, went ballistic. In style, but ballistic. That's a term, that's an idiom, suka. So how can you actually translate went ballistic in another language? Like when I was talking, I suddenly remembered. So she started to shoot? No. She didn't start to shoot, but she got very angry. And she said in style, "Excuse me, but Mr. Clinton doesn't have any position in the state or in the government. If you ask my opinion about it, I am ready to give you my opinion, but I am not ever going to channel my husband here." and everybody was shocked. And she had right. I can understand and relate to that as a woman. See, one mistake, but the whole thing was almost scandalous. It's just a little mistake, but it's not. So you have to be aware and alert every single second of your job, specifically while orally translating, interpreting. You don't have time or any other luxury to correct it. Okay, so approaching the final, media interpreting has gained more visibility and presence, especially after the Gulf War. Maybe you're too young to remember it, but I was by myself on television when it happened, and suddenly my program, which was basically consisting of arts and culture, was breaking news, broken, cut down with the voice of the Turkish simultaneous interpreter in Turkish television. She was actually giving the whole experience there from the moment. Actually, a war correspondent was at the scene. She was interpreting what he or she was saying down there in the real location of the war. I can still remember how she was talking in a very, actually, almost robotic sound, because she shouldn't give any tone. When you're actually a war correspondent, that's also very important, that you should keep your neutral status. You cannot say, oh my God, yeah, the Arabs are bombing now. You can't say that, okay? So you can't be in any part. You are the person who just has to deliver neutrally what was happening there. And I can really remember that she was saying, now, ladies and gentlemen, behind the scene, you can hear the explosions, and you could hear the other person talking in the original source language. And the explosions, as you see, can she's correcting like that, right in the middle. It has damaged the wall of that building you see in front of that statue, which is actually built in 1900. They have a lot of to gain that processing time. I can still remember. I'm having goosebumps here. Okay, so exactly, Gulf War started it all. The interpreter renders the press conferences, telephone beepers, interviews, and similar live coverage for the viewers. It is more stressful than other types of interpreting, as you can guess, as the interpreter has to deal with a wide range of technical problems coupled with the control room's hassle and wrangling during live coverage. So that's a very adventurous but very, very responsible job, I can tell you. Here we have actually put some notes for you. You can see in your reading material. And we encourage you going online, definitely, and get more informed. See you next.